Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar titled Better Experiences, Better Security, Better Healthcare, How Leaders from CDOs to CISOs Can Exceed Digital Healthcare Requirements with Modern Identity. My name is Jeanette Wider, and I'm Managing Editor of Healthcare Innovation. Today's program is sponsored by ForgeRock. Thank you to our sponsor and to our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping details. This webinar was recorded just before the Thanksgiving holiday, but the Q&A will be live. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box to the left of your video window at any time. You do not have to wait until the end of the program. For technical issues, please press F5 to refresh. And if that doesn't work, you can submit a question with your issue through the Q&A panel. Finally, join our webinar conversation on Twitter. You can tweet using the hashtag HILiveWebinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's program. Steve Gwizdala, Vice President of Healthcare at ForgeRock, and Chris Salt, Software Sales Executive at ForgeRock.
So I'm joined today with Steve here. Why don't you begin by introducing yourself, your title, your role, your background?
Sure, Jeanette. Great to be here. Hi, this is Steve Gwizdala. I am the Vice President of Healthcare for North America for ForgeRock and have been running the vertical for over 4 years. The vertical itself encompasses payers, providers, MedLife devices, and pharmaceutical health life sciences. And ForgeRock is an identity and access management company in the digital economy.
Great. So if it's okay with you, I'm just going to hop right into the questions. My first question for you is that the pandemic has changed healthcare. What types of demands are organizations facing now?
Well, healthcare is now delivered, as you know, probably most of it in digital touch points versus a blend of in-person. Before, with the pandemic, we could go in, we could see our healthcare providers, we could go into a clinic. Now with staying at home, customers and consumers or patients want a frictionless, secure, integrated, and mostly personalized experience. And the providers want a very easy way to streamline that care and reduce the overall administrative workloads that go with it. But ultimately, as a consumer, what we care about is security, that I know my identity is going to be my identity and no one else, the trust with whoever's providing that to me, and then maintaining my privacy from the minute I schedule something all the way through. So digital identity in and of itself serves as the foundation for all of those pieces. And specifically, the pandemic has changed it to online mostly.
Right. So now that healthcare is more digital than ever, what trends are you seeing in the market?
Well, unfortunately, the trend is not the best when it comes to medical. And specifically in the breach report that we actually published in ForgeRock's 2021 year, for the third year in a row, unfortunately, healthcare was the biggest target in terms of the number of breaches. It actually accounted for 34% of the total amount of breaches. And actually, it was the most expensive and costly at $474 per record. And we do expect this to continue. Our partners, PricewaterhouseCoopers, in their 2022 medical cost trend publication actually said 58%, where we were 34, 58% of the providers and nurses, they want better health tools in order to coordinate patient care, in order to help out overall with everything that's going on. And Accenture then came back to, I guess, to one-up PwC and said that of 81% of the healthcare executives say that digital transformation is more important and accelerating than ever before. So with respect to digital, healthcare organizations will be, I'm assuming they will be expected to continue to embrace technologies that will bring, like I mentioned before, flawless user experience, but then also really going after the security ultimately.
Those are some really interesting statistics. Thanks for sharing them today. So that's a lot for healthcare IT leaders to manage. How much do IT architecture influence how much they've been able to achieve?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's ultimately where you want to go, but then how do you get there? right? Yeah, kind of your point is it's a ideal state, but what's the way to get there? And most healthcare organizations overall have hybrid IT architectures. And what I mean by that is that they have things that are on premise that they can't move to the cloud, they can't go anywhere, and they have cloud solutions that are there too. But typically in those environments, those environments can't talk to each other. And because they can't talk to each other, it results in a poor experience overall and a lot of manual fixes and overall processes that need to be corrected. So to do that, you have to unite these. You have to take that fluid experience for the users that want with the security that ultimately the provider wants, and then integrate those together for like a single view of the user and the identity. So if you can think about that, for example, when you log into a provider, you go to your local hospital, you may have 4, 5, or 6 usernames and passwords, depending on where you go. One could be for the hospital. Another one could be for your electronic medical record. Maybe you had an x-ray done, so now you have one for radiology. You saw a specialist, maybe it was for orthopedic care, so they have one as well. So all of these systems right now are disparate silos. And what we're trying to do is take those disparate IT environments, scale them, manage the patients, the doctors, the employees, the devices, all the things that go with that in order to really come up with a better solution set in order to help the IT leaders manage those architectures.
Interesting. So a little bit before you mentioned digital experience, how does modern identity enable healthcare organizations to deliver both what their consumers and workforce are looking for?
It's a fine balance. It really is, because what you're trying to do is consolidate the patient data. As I mentioned before, the example with the provider, go into a single view so that the patient itself doesn't have that friction that they have today, so that you can now deliver what the consumer wants, right? So you want to have an easy consumer journey. You want to do things where they can log into multiple items from one location, but you have to keep in mind that we have to also help for scale to reduce any type of latency or downtime. We have to do things like passwordless, which is now a requirement for a lot of things that you're doing in retail to make it easier for that consumer to come in. And then you have to do things like self-service. I mean, it sounds so simple, but how many times do you try to call either your health insurance or your provider because you can't remember username and password, and they don't know how to reset it or what to do, and now you're on the phone forever? There's no easy way to do that. So something as simple as providing a self-service capability where the end user could go in and do a password reset, all of these things together tie into a healthcare organization to help their consumer. And then even on the workforce side internally, giving those workforce people the same type of experience so that they're not begrudgingly going in. Why can I do this with Home Depot, for example, and I can't do this in my own workplace? Those are the things that we try to look at.
Interesting. So with the ability to create custom user journeys and self-service capabilities, does this mean heavy lift on writing code? What's the investment from the developer side?
In the past, Jeanette, I would tell you, yes, it would absolutely a huge amount of heavy lift on writing code, then maintaining it, then hoping that as you upgrade or add new applications that you can have those same people, they haven't left the company. That's not how we approach it now. With the technology that has changed, the ability to use a no code, for example, a drag and drop interface to create a registration workflow or a user journey. So we're all focused on being able to allow the people that are setting up the journeys to drag and drop and go through that. So as I mentioned, like a self-service password reset, your account preferences, privacy settings, data sharing, all those types of components are built into journeys inside of our platform. And what we have is what's called a decision tree. And this was actually highlighted in Gartner's analyst report, where they named ForgeRock a leader in the MQ for access management. And they highlighted the ability to change these flows very quickly. So in the past, you're right, very heavy lift, writing code, trying to figure out how to maintain it, a huge staff to do so. Nowadays, actually, you and I could sit down. I hate to put the burden on us, but we could actually sit down together and map out what we want a user journey to be and drop these nodes right into the decision tree to determine if Steve comes in this way, where does he go? Do I trust him? Do I know what's going on? Do I add a new journey? How does this all fit together? And the advantage is too, is that as we move forward in time, if the business owner comes to us, let's say we're the IT group, and says, hey, we're thinking about adding a new application inside the user journey to take a little bit more data to do this, this, and this. Our answer is not a problem. We can collect that. We can do things like not only authenticating the user, but actually doing like adaptive risk and understanding who the user is, what they care about, what their attributes are, and adding more security to it, but also making it easy for the user. So yeah, times have definitely changed on what we've had in the past about those heavy lift on writing code. I mean, great question.
That's really cool. That sounds awesome. So this brings me to my next question. What about integration with existing systems like Epic or Cerner? How easy or difficult is that?
Yeah, again, tied into like the last question about how it used to be to where we are now. It's like this, it's kind of the old commercial, like, are you driving your father's Oldsmobile back in the day? Things have changed. And so the advantage now with Epic and Cerner specifically is they have started to come up to the century of where we are now with APIs. And so everything that we do is API driven and using standards. So being able to have the electronic records stored is great, but in the past, it used to be kind of in its own little microcosm. I'll pick on MyChart as an example, is when you put everything inside MyChart, the providers, they all use this as a de facto standard if they're using Epic to have their users in there, what can happen, and it's a purpose-built solution specifically for viewing electronic medical records or health records. That's what it's for. It does a really good job. But beyond that, it's truly not an identity access management tool. That's not what they're developed for. And so that's where we layer on and actually help that to put in things like adaptive risk. A great example of this is, for example, ForgeRock can actually track what device you're logging in on, whether you've been at that IP address again. We can actually look at things like taking a look at what location you're in. So we can it's called geofencing. So I can go in and say, Jeanette logged in. She originally logged in with an Apple phone. That's what she always logged in with under this iOS system at this location. Somebody else nefarious tries to log in with your credentials from a different area. Number one, it's on an Android phone, doesn't match your normal profile. Number two, she just logged in from Chicago. Now she's trying to log in from New York, and it's literally 30 minutes apart. That's where we start to take in things saying, no, I don't accept this as a login. I'm going to challenge Jeanette, and I'm going to do things like, maybe I send a text to your, depending on what the client wants to do, a text to your phone or an email or a phone call or something that starts to step up that authentication that now allows you to feel comfortable as the consumer, and myself on the IT side, whether it's on the security side or the IT proper, knows that now we are protecting that user and the credentials, and we're doing things, it's in a seamless fashion, but it challenges enough that we feel comfortable using these standards and what we're tied to make a user-friendly experience, but also make it very, very secure.
Interesting. Okay, so going back to siloed data that we talked about before, if a company is dealing with siloed data, are they a candidate for identity solutions or are they not ready?
They are a candidate. But what happens, we have to do is really take a look at where the data is stored and how it's being stored. Over the past few years, there's been a lot of shadow IT. And what I mean by that is instead of going to the IT group, the business owners say, I don't have time. I don't have time to wait for them to catch up to me. I need to bring this application or this device to market quickly in order to help people. Let's go find something and plug it in. So you have all these individual silos of information specifically around users that is really kind of displaced. It's in its own fragmented area. And now that kind of goes back to my example of when I mentioned you go into like a provider to your local hospital and you have 5 username and logins. That was not calculated to give you 5 username and logins. What happened was each individual group that has your identity and your association with it created their own application. And we as the patient get frustrated. It's like, why do I have to have all these? What do I need to do? So when you look at that, we use ForgeRock, what we do is we overall and look at the patient, the departments, what's happening, and we can start consolidating those identities. And what we can do with that is start treating it as either by relationship and federation, meaning leave it alone, leave it where it is, but federate to it. But then we can start consuming that and putting it inside of our directory so that we become the single point of truth in order to move forward and start deprecating or shutting down those systems that have multiple identity capabilities. So yes, it's very kind of a start where you are, see what your environment is, how do we attach to it, what can we start deprecating over time. So this is not a big like lift and shift type approach. It's really more, how do we be very surgical? And I don't mean about that on the pun for healthcare, but how do we be very surgical on what we attack first and where we need to go?
For the record, I like the pun. Yeah, and I can definitely relate to the multiple passwords and this and that. I mean, in healthcare especially, it's much more important than, I don't know, my Netflix account and stuff, and trying to keep those straight. So earlier, you gave an important statistic that healthcare is the #1 target of cyber criminals. What role does modern identity play to help mitigate risks?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it is true. It is the #1 target. And you brought up a great comment. A Netflix password versus your medical record number, completely different. Because an MRN number, unfortunately, travels with us all the time. So if someone does get your medical record number and they can go in and do false claims against your insurance provider, you don't even know. All these things are happening. Where Netflix, because somebody's getting in your account or doing something, it's or even like a breached credit card. I hate to belittle that, but I can call the credit card agency and say, cancel my card, get a new one issued. Yes, it's a pain to go take things off of auto payment, et cetera, but it doesn't persist. A medical record, healthcare does persist. So to your point about what role does modern identity play to help that, there's some terms that came out recently within the last 5 years called zero trust and CARTA, which is an acronym about continually to assess and make sure that you understand on real time who that person is. So we look at it, as I mentioned previously, is we look at behaviors, we look at the device, so device fingerprinting, we look at the geofencing, we look at the network, we look at all these types of things and apply a fine-grained access and authorization to anything that we do. So for example, if a customer said, Steve or Jeanette can log in and they can see normal things, but if they want to see fine-grained things, like they want to see like what prescriptions they have, maybe you want to take a look at your x-ray, things that are a little bit more than just the front door, you can do, again, fine-grained access to that to say anything that is beyond this, let's do a stepped up authentication, but let's make it seamless to the customer. So it's not always binary, because if it's the same phone, same network, same behavior, you just logged off, logged back in, we know everything about you. Do I really need to challenge you or not? In the old days, the word step up was no matter what, it was binary. If you logged off, logged back in, whether you moved 10 feet or 0, you had to be automatically challenged again. We've actually changed that to do continuous collection and look about the user and understand the user to see what's going on. And so that really helps us overall from a user identity perspective, mitigate the risks in general for the customer themselves, not the patient, but the actual customer using the technology. I'll give you a real example. So a major healthcare provider and actually retailer used one of our products that uses AI, so artificial intelligence, called autonomous identity. And they went across all of their users and looked at all the entitlements, everything that was being assigned to these different groups to see what was going on with respect to all of their users. They found in under 3 hours, over 500,000 excess entitlements. And what that means is they're actually over provisioning the rights to applications over 500,000 out of 14.6 million assignments. What that means is people have access to records or to applications, et cetera, that they really shouldn't. And that's the part that we look at is say, okay, do we have the right access? Do we have risky access? How does this all fit together and help us mitigate our overall risks?
Wow. Okay, so how difficult is it to implement zero trust with a modern identity solution like ForgeRock?
Well, as I mentioned before, Jeanette, when I was joking about you and I writing the code with a drag and drop, but really it is that. It's drag and drop orchestration. We have pre-built integrations to partners. We actually have our trust network. And what this does is things like behavioral metrics, fraud and risk management, identity proofing. We as a company in identity can't be all things to all people. I joke about it, but back when I think it was Ghost Protocol from Mission Impossible, they had to get through to a vault, and they joked about the biometric that was being used, that they had to have a certain gait on their walk in order to get through that. And at the time, I think it was like 8 years ago, everybody kind of joked and said, really, you're going to measure someone's gait to see if it's actually them? We actually have a partner that does that. There's no way we could keep up with all these different biometrics, whether it's retinal scan like you have on your iPhone, whether it's a thumbprint scan, whether you're looking at, we have partners that do how hard you hit on the keyboard. They watch your metrics to say, is it really Jeanette? Because she doesn't normally pound the keyboard the same way. They're adding all of these. They're always trying to step one step ahead of the nefarious, people that are out there. Because of that, what we do is we create this orchestration engine to allow you to plug in. So if you came to me and said, hey, Steve, we really have this great partner that does the following thing. Can we integrate it into ForgeRock to help out with our zero trust? Our answer would be absolutely. Let's talk to them. Let's figure out, we'll create an engineering-centric relationship and let them create a node that you can actually drag and drop right into your engine. So we're constantly evolving, but we also realize that we cannot be all things to all people. So we've left it open. Think of it like the Apple Store. It's verified. That's what we do with them, but we have an engineering-centric relationship, not just a marketing type relationship. And that helps us really be adaptable and really truly implement zero trust.
That's cool. Very interesting. So now that healthcare is relying heavily on the connected Internet of medical things, how does modern identity play into that specifically?
Yeah, ForgeRock actually takes a much different approach to IOMP or IoT. We actually treat the medical devices or the medical things as a unique identity. And let me explain what that means. So let's say you and I have an identity. We're already in a system and we are assigned a product. Let's say I go in and the doctor says, Steve, I really want to do a 48-hour test on your EKG. Here's an EKG machine. I'm going to strap it to you. It sits on your belt. Take it home. Let it record for 48 hours. Bring it back, and we're going to see how you do over the next 2 days. In a traditional identity and access management solution, that machine, which has a unique identity, would be associated to me as an attribute. We don't treat it that way. We actually treat the EKG machine as a separate, unique identity. And the reason we do that is this. I now take that identity of the EKG machine and I'll relate it to me. We're both unique identities. I use it for 48 hours. I bring it back to the doctor's office. They don't have to disassociate it from my profile. They simply disassociate between the two unique identities. Now you come in and they can give you that same EKG machine, but it's not associated to me. It's not part of my profile. It was just a unique identity. So now you can take it and you have no risk of it somehow getting into my profile or grabbing my data, et cetera. So this really goes after how do you secure the IOMT? How do you secure the overall data? Then how do you map and manage that relationship between that device and the actual human? And so that's very unique for ForgeRock, is that we actually treat the IOMT device as a unique identity, not an extension of somebody else's identity. And that's where reuse comes into play. And it's really actually has taken off quite greatly, unfortunately, over the past 2 years with COVID pandemic, because there are a lot of devices that are being assigned to people that are being reused. Pulse ox is a great example of that. That is going home, coming back, being assigned to somebody else. And the amount of complexity to try to map and manage that, if it was an extension of your identity, not a separate identity, would be extremely difficult.
Okay, so the next thing I want to move on to talk about is regulation. So there's a lot of important healthcare regulations like HIPAA and the 21st Century Cures Act. How does identity help organizations comply?
So HIPAA is great. You also have California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, right? You also have GDPR. The advantages with ForgeRock is we're compliant to all of those. We actually were founded as a company over in Europe first before we moved to the United States. So when the US was struggling with GDPR, we were already part of that committee and working with them for all of our European counterpart customers that were already doing it. So for confidentiality, we know that the information itself cannot be made available or disclosed to anybody who's unauthorized, whether it's an individual, an entity, or a process. All of our integrity of the components for accuracy and completeness of information, that's all safeguarded under processes and control. And then the availability of the information is only upon demand and by authorized entities only. And that applies to virtually everything that you're thinking of, whether it's GLBA in the finance industry, GDPR globally, CCPA out west, which is my prognostication is that will be replicated into multiple states as we continue to move forward, because everybody seems to want to copy everything else. And then obviously HIPAA is part of that. But we tie into privacy and consent on our dashboards, which now allows you to know from a provenance of trust who authorized what when. And there's a standard called user managed access, or UMA, that I'm sure we will cover in a different time. But that is part of that on being able to manage your settings. Also on the healthcare side, FHIR, FHIR is a standard that has come out for data portability as part of the 21st Century Cures Act. And it enables patients to incorporate and collaborate with their data and share consistency. So as a company, I know I kind of went on a little bit beyond HIPAA, but I just want to make sure that from HIPAA and 21st Century Cures Act, which is the question that you asked, is it's not just complying with that, but also holistically looking at all the different items that come into play for regulations, because I do foresee, as I mentioned, CCPA was a direct clone and copy of GDPR. And then, HIPAA itself kind of overarches things as well. So moving forward, I think the advantage of ForgeRock is we have all these experiences, and it'll be help to continue to keep forward and keep ahead of things that change.
Great. That's great to hear. So I'm a provider and I'm ready to modernize identity systems. How long would it take?
Well, first of all, I'll have one of my major account executives send you the contract for signature since you're ready.
That sounds really good.
Okay. Secondly, that's a great question, right? How long does it take? It really, I hate to answer it this way, but it's true. It's called it depends. And the reason it says it depends is, are we looking at just, as we joked about before, surgically taking one component, improving that, and then moving it all the way out? And let me expand on that. The flexibility to consume ForgeRock, you can consume it as a service, software as a service. You could say, well, I'm not ready for that. I don't want it in your cloud. I want it on my own private cloud. Okay, well, we can do that too. Or they'd be like, you know what? We invested tens of millions of dollars at your facility in our own data center. Our answer is fine. Let's deploy it in your data center. So that's kind of the first question. The second one is, we're very modular. So you probably heard people talk about eat the elephant approach, which is you got to do everything in all now. And people used to joke about it, saying you hear that big sucking sound in the background. That's project A, whatever that is. It could be EHR, it could be ERP, it could be anything. With modularity, we can be very, very specific on what your need is and go after that, wrap it up, get immediate value, and then take that value and start consuming other areas, like we talked about in the previous question about what if I have multiple identities, multiple things? Well, we can pick one and then start incorporating the other ones in there. So to go back to your question about timeline, how does it take? Your current environment, where we start, and how do we deploy? I mean, we could be talking weeks, we could be talking months, and then some people on journeys that want to do extremely complex things, they release it on business releases, but it could be a year or two before they do everything. So the good news is the modularity allows us to go at the pace that you as the consumer, meaning the customer, want to take.
And a follow-up question, what happens to legacy systems when you start this modernization journey in identity?
Great question. So your existing investments, what we want to do is we want to build on those. So if you came to me and said, hey, Steve, there's no way we can take product A out right now. Our answer would be is, okay, how do we layer our security controls on top of that product A to add additional value? So example would be is your current system doesn't do passwordless or doesn't do frictionless or cannot do multi-factor. Our answer would be is let's automate that with our solution, tie it into your legacy system as a coexist strategy. And then over time, let's start taking out the capabilities of product A in order to put it 100% into ours and allow us to sunset that old system that doesn't have the adequate capabilities that you're looking for in order to get there. The other part I mentioned before, but I want to highlight this, is that the way we've set up our API first design allows us to coexist not just with a cloud solution, but all your legacy solutions as well. So we can have immediate and sustained value tying to those systems as we go. So all of those tie into what do we do with your legacy systems? How do we do that? Do we run concurrently? Do we start taking things out? How fast can we deprecate? Where are they tied into? And ultimately, overall, looking at how do we mitigate any potential disruptions, both for you as the customer, meaning running your own IT staff, et cetera. How do we take the burden away from that? And then how do we also mitigate any potential disruptions, either if it's for your workforce or your patients? How do we make sure we don't have any issues there too? So that's how we really tie into legacy systems.
Okay, and you mentioned deployment options. Can you give us some more details?
Yeah, right. On the question that we answered earlier, I had mentioned being able to deploy in any environment. So let me explain that, because that's a great question. Carry on. So traditional deployment on-premise, that could be in your security operations center, your network operations center, on-prem, et cetera. Can we do that? Yes. Second thing is most people are trying to move away from that environment into a private cloud environment. And what I mean by private cloud is you as the customer are using like AWS, for example, or Microsoft Azure, Google GCP platform. You've picked one of your own cloud environments for your applications. Our answer is we can do that too. In fact, we have cookbooks, which are pre-built all the key through Kubernetes, et cetera, that we can give to you and say, you want to deploy on AWS? Here's everything. You want to deploy on Azure? Here's everything. You want to deploy on Google? Here's everything. And the reason we do that is to make your deployment much simpler. So you don't have a learning curve of, oh, well, you gave me the code to run on my private cloud, but I have to add all these different things to it. I want to run high availability, or I need disaster recovery. How do I do that? The answer is check the box, let it deploy. And since it's all DevOps focused, the advantage of that is rebuilding, doing anything necessary, having it as backup. That burden is off of you from an architectural standpoint, and you can focus just on the capabilities of our software. And then ultimately, so we have on-prem, we have private cloud, and ultimately you may want to consume it as software as a service. And we have that as well. So our SaaS definitely has a unique architecture to it that, because we built it most recently over the last few years versus those that moved to SaaS 10 years ago, is that we have tenant isolation. And what I mean by that is that you don't have a noisy neighbor. So if a neighbor is, let's pick on your healthcare payer, so your insurance companies. As you probably know, if you go in October, you have open enrollment. Sometimes it carries over till now to November. Well, everybody and their brother is logging in to set up what they need to do for their benefits for next year. So it goes from very little traffic to it could be millions of people that all of a sudden are logging in the last week to set all their preferences for next year. The noisy neighbor in a multi-tenant solution, meaning everybody runs off the same and doesn't do tenant isolation like we are, you could actually be impacted by one of your neighbors running off the SaaS because of the amount of volume actually slowing your response time and creating latency to you. We don't do that. And so the advantage of that is that your speed, your throughput, there's no throttling on our side. We do not throttle like APIs or number of people that can come in. We don't do any of that. And the reason we do that is we have some customers that are running millions, hundreds of millions of identity. I won't even say millions, hundreds of millions of identities. And they cannot afford, I mentioned retail before. We're starting to go into Black Friday. They're starting to announce things now, and they can't afford latency. They will lose tens of millions of dollars of revenue if they have that. So really that's the advantage of us, is on-prem, in a private cloud, or in SaaS. And what's very unique about that is that it's the code set the same for all three. So you can pick anywhere in your journey. You could start on-prem and then a year from now say, you know what? Our strategy is to move everything to software as a service. Our answer is, okay, let's move there. Or vice versa. Someone starts as software as a service and a year from now decides, I want to pull back and I want to put it on my on-prem. We have a whole different strategy. That's the flexibility of ForgeRock, is allowing you to have all those deployment options of on-prem, in a private cloud, or as software as a service.
Cool. So that brings me to my next question about budgets, which are always top of mind when it comes to healthcare. Will modernizing identity be a significant investment, or does it actually help reduce costs?
I would say the latter, meaning it definitely does help reduce costs. And the reason being, as we talked about this previously, is that you have multiple systems, and those systems could be anything from a SQL database with users to your EHR to your, if you're talking internal, it could be your HR system that has onboarding in it. It could be that you have things in, like we mentioned, the 5 logins for going to your hospital. Each one of those is maintaining you as a user inside of that. So the ability to go in and reduce the amount of systems that you have currently for user IDs and passwords is one. The second one is the reducing your IT resource, because the resource, time, and budget to maintain all those systems, let's pick on those 5 that I talked about before. Somebody has to be adept at maintaining the radiology one, the orthopedic one, the one that you log into the hospital, the EHR, EMR. Somebody has to know every one of those systems to figure out what to do with the identity. So what our goal is to reduce the number of IT resources, time, and budget by going back to that no code, low code approach. And if we can get you to cloud, that's even better, right? Because then we can take off and deprecate all the hardware, the infrastructure, all the middleware, everything that's involved on maintaining the software on-prem. If we get you to software as a service, that's our responsibility. So patching, upgrading, maintaining, that's our job, not you as the healthcare customer. And that ultimately ties into more predictable pricing model overall to reduce cost.
Okay. So lastly, the last question I have for you today is, I've seen ForgeRock a lot in the news recently. What makes ForgeRock, your company, unique in the market?
So I think we covered a lot of those things that are unique to us. So I would start with that ability to be on-prem, in your private cloud, or SaaS. We're the only provider that can do all 3. The other piece is, instead of hearing it just from me, if you went out and went to Gartner, Forrester, and Cooper/Cole, which are the top 3 analyst firms in this sector, and looked at specifically consumer identity access management, or CIAM. It's been called a lot of different things. Some call it XIAM because they're dealing with consumers, they're dealing with patients, they're dealing with members. We tend to call it B2E, which is business to everyone, because it's not just business to consumer, it's not just business to business. You're dealing with healthcare providers, you're dealing with clinical trials. I mean, when you start to get into pharmaceutical and health life sciences, there are so many different elements that they're collaborating with from an external perspective. So you as the patient, your primary care physician, your healthcare provider, the clinical trial, all these people are coming into play. So we really do that. So if you look at it from CIAM with Gartner, Forrester, and Cooper/Cole, you'll see how we're unique and how we're the only provider in the CIAM space that scored in the highest quadrant for all 3 of them. If we tie into what we talked about before with HIPAA, and then actually our number 1 is our scale. So we kind of joke about it, but it's actually a big thing that makes us unique. We talk about 1 million is considered small, 10 million is considered medium, and 100 million is considered a large deployment for us. We have over 3 billion, that's with a B, 3 billion identities under management currently with ForgeRock, which if you took our 2 closest competitors combined, they don't even come up to that same number. And then lastly, I would say what's unique to us, specifically to this conversation is healthcare. We are investing significantly in the healthcare market in our vertical. And we have actually been involved with, we're one of the founders of the Open ID Foundation for Health Relationship Trust, which is HEART, which is a working group. We're a founder and leader in the UMA, which is User Managed Access Standard. What that is the ability for you as the patient to go in and delegate who can see what when. So for example, I go in to have surgery, and Jeanette, you're my sister, and I want to be able to share my data with you just in case you need to have access to it. I don't give you my username and password. I give you access in the system for you to log in under your own username and own password to see my records. I also delegate what you can or cannot see. So perhaps I only give you access to my medications because you need to know that. That is all tracked for the customer. So in this case, the provider or the medical payer. So they know when I gave it to you, what I gave you, and when you log in, when you have access, et cetera. So the whole privacy consent, that all components of it is fully tracked. And then when I decide to rescind or redact that, I do that as the patient. I don't have to call anybody. I do that. And then in turn, it logs that whole trust again that Steve redacted it, took Jeanette's access to it away on this date, and locks it all down. That's user managed access. And that is very unique to ForgeRock. And it's one of our key elements that we were involved with in the founder and leadership of UMA. This goes all the way back to GDPR days and what we were doing from that whole capability from the end user perspective. And lastly, I would talk about the fact that our CTO is one of the technical experts for the U.S. Office of National Coordinator, ONC, for Health IT. And she works specifically on health IT priorities, API security, and privacy. So overall, like I said, for what makes this unique, I would say the scores that we're getting from all the outside independent consultants, our capability to really focus on healthcare, our ability to scale, and then our unique ability to handle on-prem, in the cloud, or SaaS definitely separates us from everyone else.
Great, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it. It was really interesting. And next up, I believe we have your colleague, Chris, coming in to do our live Q&A. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, as I said, now Chris Salt is here to answer audience questions. We've already had some questions come in. However, we would also like to remind you to use the Q&A box to the left of your video window at any time. Hi, Chris.
Hey, how are you?
Good, thank you. So our first question from the audience is, when is ForgeRock's annual event? Does ForgeRock do one still?
Yeah, we typically do this event in the summer, usually somewhere between May and late June timeframe. You can visit our website to view our June 2021 ID Live on demand. It's ForgeRock.com /identity-live for that event. It's a really interesting event with a large amount of customers that speak. It's not just a bunch of talking heads from ForgeRock, so to speak.
Okay. So the next one is, who are some notable ForgeRock customers?
Yeah, so many of these customers, just as a disclaimer, I can mention verbally, some have, we can't put their logos and other information on our website, but including but not limited to Humana, CVS Health, Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield, Florida Blue, Bristol Myers Squibb, Baptist Health, Johnson & Johnson Healthcare Service Corporation, and Centara Health. All of these organizations are on their own journey to be able to, as Steve said, modernize their consumer identity and access management. So there, again, some are at the beginning of that journey and some are fully in production.
Okay. The next question is, can ForgeRock integrate with Epic in the cloud?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, we're happy to report that ForgeRock not only integrates with Epic, but we also make it extremely simple to fortify that experience that Steve talked about from a consumer, patient, member experience perspective. And we do this by allowing existing users and new users to log in seamlessly without third-party intervention, all done in the ForgeRock Identity Cloud in conjunction with any EHR or electronic health record vendor. From our understanding, we're the only identity vendor which allows this coexistence strategy without relying on a third party. And I'm happy to discuss that because it goes pretty deep, discuss that offline as well.
Okay, great. The next question says, we would like to move to a software as a service model for our identity program, but we feel there are some use cases for on-prem still. Is this what you meant when you stated you can deliver in a hybrid environment as well?
Yeah, I hope this is from a prospective customer because this is our sweet spot. So yes, ForgeRock has the ability to eliminate the challenges of integrating both your legacy applications that Steve spoke to with your modern SaaS applications for that holistic approach to your identity strategy and program. Interestingly enough, we, again, and I'm trying not to toot our horn, but we're the only vendor that has the same code base, fully same code base for our on-prem or on-premise offering, as well as our SaaS or ForgeRock Identity Cloud platform, making it ideal for true hybrid strategy. Again, if someone feels that's important enough to talk, we can schedule 20, 30 minutes or as long as you'd like to fully understand where you're headed in 2022 and beyond. As well as just to note on this question, because it really is extremely important. Everybody wants to jump into SaaS because everyone's talking about it, but it helps to understand what they mentioned cloud, and cloud and SaaS are different. It's like the tail wagging the dog sometimes. Something to keep in mind for this is that we're able to get you started with that journey, whether you're not ready for not ready for the full SaaS offering, and that's when it becomes hybrid. You're using some of our software as a service and some of the on-premise offering as well. Okay,
it looks like we have time for one more question. So when is ForgeRock's next webinar?
So the next webinar, it's coming up soon. So December 8th, so it's next week, 10 a.m. Pacific time. I believe it's titled 4 Technologies for Designing and Captivating Digital CIAM for Consumer Identity and Access Management Journeys. And this is hosted, I believe, with Deloitte, and pretty excited about it. It's going to be a good webinar.
Okay, thanks so much, Steve. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Steve and Chris once again for today's excellent webinar. I would also like to thank our sponsor, ForgeRock, for making today's program possible. Finally, I want to thank everyone in our audience for joining us. We hope you'll join us in the future for another healthcare innovation webinar. This concludes today's presentation.